average TikTok influencer notwithstanding, human beings are, first and foremost, creatures of the mind. Our ability to calculate and abstractly reason sets us apart from every other material thing on Earth. Naturally, one might entertain thoughts about the limits, or lack thereof, of the human mind, and the psychic powers it may potentially possess. Can a person actually read the thoughts of another? Could one travel to a time and place using only one's mind? Is it possible to gain insight into the future, or alter the laws of probability at will? And more fundamentally, is there a way to test for such abilities? The term psychic is somewhat of a catch-all, combining a host of different claimed phenomena, some of which are markedly more plausible than others, as some are conceivably subject to empirical support and are therefore fruitful fodder for research. This isn't to say such support has ever definitively been found, but attempting to do so is far from an insurmountable task. In the broadest sense, a psychic ability could be described as a wild or idiosyncratic mental talent, either with or without a physical component. Keeping this in mind, psychic phenomena can be classified into a few general categories. Precognitions can be classified as any claims about future events, whether directed at the claimant or another party, obtained through one of numerous means. Typically, claims range from the vacuously vague to the exceedingly specific. A well-known, though somewhat unconvincing, example of precognition would be that of late celebrity soothsayer Jeane Dixon, who, in an article published in Parade magazine on May 13, 1956, predicted the 1960 U.S. presidential election would be, quote, dominated by Labor and won by a Democrat, but he will be assassinated or die in office, though not necessarily in his first term, unquote. Although precognitions like those of Ms. Dixon can conceivably be tested, accuracy does not necessarily prove the existence of paranormal phenomena. Like predicting a future conflict in the Middle East or an earthquake in Japan, many claimed precognitions are little more than good, educated guesses, based on clever reasoning or a working knowledge of current events. Note, though a precognition is functionally the same as a premonition, it is not qualitatively the same. Premonitions are generally one-off events, often prophetic dreams or visions, experienced by laypersons that do not normally claim to have psychic abilities. Because of their sudden, unexpected nature, premonitions are discovered after the fact, meaning the event in question precedes the revelation about it. Precognitions are by definition claims made beforehand. Thus, in precognitions, the event follows the revelation. An example of a premonition is that of 10-year-old Errol May Jones, who, on October 20th, 1966, dreamt of a nondescript black mass engulfing her school in Aberfan, Wales. On the following day, an enormous mound of coal situated above the town collapsed, sending thousands of tons of black sludge onto the Pantglass school, crushing the building and killing 144 adults and children, Errol May Jones among them. The darling of the New Age movement and military intelligence services, ESP is, as the name suggests, the supposed ability to gain information using some perceptual sense other than the 5 commonly known. Notable subcategories include clairvoyance, also known as remote viewing, seeing, at least within the mind's eye, details of a distant or hidden location, such as the contents of a sealed envelope; clairaudience, hearing sounds in a distant location; clairsentience, sensitivity to the emotional state or perceptions of another individual or group of individuals, whether remote or otherwise. Practitioners may sometimes be referred to as empaths. Psychometry, obtaining information about the history or pedigree of a physical object by touching said object. Although it shares a similar name, this supposed ability is not related to psychometrics, which is the medical, non-paranormal practice of measuring psychological characteristics through testing and observation. And confuthesia, the ability to actively use one sense to perform the ability of another. Although certain medical conditions, such as chromesthesia, the phenomena of seeing colors when listening to music, largely mimic this sort of paranormal claim, confuthesia is not simply one's brain perceiving in an unusual way, but doing so in an anatomically impossible way. An example of this particular feat is found in 15-year-old Linda Anderson of Lowell, Massachusetts, who, in 1964, claimed, among other things, to be able to read printed words while blindfolded, using only the touch of her hand. Although claims of ESP can be scientifically tested to some degree, results can be embellished, fabricated, or misinterpreted more easily than other types of phenomena, primarily due to its often fleeting or ambiguous nature. Like ESP, divination, often called fortune-telling, attempts to obtain information through paranormal means, but doing so by using some sort of physical component, often biological, as a sort of mental focus. This is perhaps the broadest and most ancient psychic discipline, subcategories using virtually any item one can think of during its practice, such as tasseomancy, the reading of spent tea leaves, cartomancy, the reading of tarot cards, splonkomancy, the divination through the reading of human entrails, scapulomancy, the reading of bones, chiromancy, the reading of palms, water and mirror scrying, and crystal gazing. Again, like ESP, divination is subject to wild swings in interpretation and reliability. There is little one can do to experimentally test such claims, although several individual fortune tellers reading the palm of a particular subject and deriving more or less the same information independently would certainly be interesting from a scientific standpoint. Telepathy is the direct non-verbal communication between two or more recognized individuals. Telepathic communication, also called thought transference, can consist of visual imagery, transmitting the image of a Bible, or alphanumeric, transmitting the text of the 23rd Psalm. Interestingly, telepathy is perhaps the most plausible of all psychic claims, as there is little to no barrier to it apart from technical. No law of physics or biology precludes telepathy, although human brains are not, as far as we know, constructed in such a way as to organically transmit or receive signals. If small transceivers were implanted within the brains of two or more individuals, and said transceivers were designed to convert neurochemical impulses into electromagnetic ones, those individuals could then be said to be, for all intents and purposes, telepathic. Of course, one only has to recall the CrowdStrike internet outage of 2024 to see how such a technological scenario could easily careen into the dystopian. Like telepathy, mediumship or channeling involves paranormal communication, though in this case, only the claimant is a recognized party, and is in fact an intermediary between some unseeable entity and an audience. Claimed examples of mediumship include channeling extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional beings, such as that hosted by author and spiritualist Daryl Anka, an entity named Bashar. Those who would speak to and for the dead, such as participants in the popular 19th and 20th century pastime of seances, would also qualify, provided they themselves act as mouthpieces. Obviously, mediumship of any kind is more or less reliant upon the sincerity of the claimant, and is next to impossible to disprove or support via observation. Indeed, the fact that many well-known mediums charge eye-watering sums for a session with their altered state makes one wonder if their motives are a great deal more earthly than is initially presented. Of course, if a channeler such as Mr. Anka were to rattle off some bit of knowledge that could be verified and was as yet unknown to humanity, some legitimacy would undoubtedly be granted toward Bashar or any of his cosmic cousins. Psychokinesis, also called telekinesis, is the remote movement of or physical change to an object using only one's mental will. Spoon-bending is a popular supposed application of this ability, as is the turning of book pages or movement of compass needles. Like psychic, psychokinesis is somewhat of an umbrella term, encompassing a host of other mind-over-matter abilities, including but not limited to pyrokinesis, hydro or cryokinesis, phytokinesis, ergokinesis, and apportation, the instantaneous transportation of an object from one location to another. Psychoprojection is a related set of commonly claimed abilities, involving, as the name would suggest, the projection of oneself, either physically or ephemerally, to another location, such as teleportation, the instantaneous transportation of oneself between two places; bilocation, the creation of an image of oneself in two separate locations simultaneously; and so-called astral travel, the movement of a spiritual form of oneself through some distance apart from one's physical body. Interestingly, the most intriguing examples of the latter phenomenon are one-off occurrences, generally known as out-of-body experiences, usually spontaneously performed by those suffering from great physical trauma or mental stress. Both psychokinesis and psychoprojection can easily be laboratory tested, provided due care is taken during observation to ensure some sort of fakery is not afoot, such as a double-blind experiment where target information is unknown and unknowable until the experiment's conclusion. Throughout the 20th century, concerted efforts had been made by the Soviets at large, and the KGB specifically, to investigate telepathy, as well as remote viewing, inducement of telekinetic powers on non-psychic individuals, and, if one can believe it, the measurable effects of black magic incantations. As wild and fringe as some of this research seems, it is very likely Western intelligence bureaus, such as the CIA and DIA in the United States, were actively conducting the same or very similar. Indeed, a declassified Central Intelligence Agency report from April 1977 not only notes Soviet attempts to harness remote viewing, but notes the differences in clinical conditions between remote viewing experiments in the United States and the USSR. None of this is anywhere as ridiculous as it first seems, and it is easy to see how both sides of the Cold War were entirely justified in their respective pursuits. The usefulness of positive results of psychic testing is obvious, as it would lead to a veritable suite of espionage tools as groundbreaking as the advent of the orbital satellite. Although not as obvious, negative results would also be justified, as it would generate large amounts of data which could be used for a number of practical applications, including psychological warfare, covert sociological manipulation, and effective propaganda. In the 1970s, desperate to achieve parity, if not superiority, with their Soviet counterparts, the Central Intelligence Agency sponsored a series of experiments under an initiative entitled Scanate, a portmanteau of scanned by coordinate, later reclassified under the umbrella of a United States government project named Stargate, all of which attempting to determine the viability of remote viewing and related endeavors. The earliest and most enthusiastically pursued Scanate experiments were conducted at the non-profit, privately owned Stanford Research Institute, currently known as SRI International, in Menlo Park, California. Created by the trustees of Stanford University in 1946, the Stanford Research Institute was, and remains as of the production of this video, a more or less mainstream laboratory for engineering, chemistry, applied sciences, and consumer technology. Throughout the decades, the SRI was instrumental in the development of, among other things, magnetic ink, the computer mouse, robotics, artificial intelligence, and synthetic fabrics, such as Xylon. During the 1970s, several, at least partially CIA-sponsored Scanate tests were conducted at the SRI by electrical engineer Harold Puthoff and physicist Russell Targ. The two men would eventually become recognized as leaders in psychic research, their proponents emboldened by what was perceived to be unassailable credibility, and skeptics disheartened by what seemed a grievous lapse in scientific reasoning. Native Chicagoan Harold Puthoff earned his doctorate from Stanford University in 1967, specializing in the engineering and application of lasers and the fundamentals of stochastic electrodynamics, a field of study which attempts to use classical physics to approximate quantum theory. During his time at Stanford, Puthoff expressed considerable interest in the paranormal, specifically in regards to psychic powers, which would eventually lead to involvement with the quasi-religious Church of Scientology, where Puthoff claimed to, at one point, experience moments of clairvoyance. An eclectic set of interests, indeed, likely due to his highly theoretical work, which involved very exotic subatomic particles, such as perpetually superluminal tachyons that seemed to experience time in ways at odds with normal reality. Quote, "Some of their properties were similar to the kinds of things that were reported for the psychic function," unquote. Undoubtedly spurred on by the chance to work in a field he found endlessly fascinating, Puthoff left his position at Stanford University to found the Electronics and Bioengineering Laboratory at the SRI, where he would eventually encounter his research partner, Russell Targ. By contrast, Russell Targ, coincidentally also born in Chicago, cultivated a persistent fascination with the paranormal and unconventional since childhood, exposed to the works of Helena Blavatsky, Erich von Däniken, and other nonconformists within the stacks of his family's bookstore. Eventually, Targ earned a Bachelor of Science in Physics from Queen's College in 1954, spending nearly the next 20 years researching the construction and application of lasers. In late 1972, Targ became senior research physicist in the Electronics and Bioengineering Lab at SRI, where he would remain for the following 10 years. The first consequential subject of the SRI's Project Scanate was a Colorado-born artist and self-professed psychic, Ingo Douglas Swann. Swann, a cigar-chewing, good-natured, and by most accounts highly intelligent man, was first introduced to Harold Puthoff in March of 1972, when he learned of a research proposal while visiting the laboratory of Cleve Baxter, a former CIA polygrapher and interrogation expert who devoted a great deal of time to measuring the perceptual abilities of plants. Said proposal was written by Puthoff and suggested avenues of investigation into the quantum biology of lower organisms. Intrigued, Swann wrote a letter of inquiry to Puthoff, explaining that he had successfully completed psychokinetic experiments at City College in New York, and that he was willing to participate in similar experiments in California. Recognizing a rare and apropos opportunity, Puthoff quickly invited Swann to the SRI. In June of 1972, Swann traveled to the Stanford University campus and was escorted by Puthoff to the basement of the Varian Physics Building to begin a week of paranormal testing, a summary of which is provided in the book Mind Reach, co-authored by Puthoff and Russell Targ. At the time, Dr. Arthur Hebard, a well-regarded research associate who had obtained his PhD from Stanford a year earlier, was undertaking an experiment involving an unusual piece of hardware located in a shielded vault beneath the building, a superconducting magnetometer, colloquially known as a quark detector, the normal purpose of which was to, as the name would suggest, detect the presence of elementary subatomic particles known as quarks. Specifically, the device could measure extremely small fluctuations in magnetic fields, equivalent to about 1/1,000,000th the strength of that which normally encompasses the Earth. Most importantly, the apparatus was designed in such a way as to be all but impervious to outside physical influence, save for that which could naturally be accounted for. It was the opinion of Puthoff that experiments attempting to detect the presence of psychic phenomena would likely need to use some type of hypersensitive superconductivity, as such phenomena probably involved physical interactions on a scale far below what one would normally experience in everyday life. Considering this, Dr. Hebard's quark detector fit the proverbial bill. Taking care not to disclose any details about the detector's inner workings or construction, Puthoff explained to Swann that he wanted him to, if possible, psychically affect the magnetic field within the detector. The goings-on would be observed by Puthoff, as well as a decidedly skeptical but agreeable Dr. Hebard and a physicist named Dr. Martin Lee, who took a break from his work at the Stanford Linear Accelerator to indulge his curiosity. It is important to note that just prior to Puthoff and Swann's arrival, a decaying magnetic field had been generated within the detector, creating a very stable oscillating signal on the associated paper chart recorder, essentially a calibrated baseline by which Puthoff could measure psychic effects. With this in mind, the physicists watched the recorder as Swann announced he would focus his attention. After about 5 seconds, the recorder showed a doubling of the baseline oscillation, which lasted for an additional 30 seconds, an indication that the field was decaying at twice the expected rate. Dr. Hebard, at least according to Puthoff, was startled. Dr. Lee's reaction is not mentioned. Perhaps not unexpectedly, Dr. Hebard wondered if the apparatus was somehow malfunctioning, and suggested that Swann would be better served if he simply halted the field change completely, thus removing all doubt that he was in fact the cause. Once again, Swann focused his attention, and again, after a short delay of about 5 seconds, the oscillations seemed to completely stop for 45 seconds. Swann then announced he couldn't hold it any longer, and the recording returned to normal. Taken aback, Puthoff was quick to ask Swann how he had performed this amazing feat. Swann explained that he had experienced a direct vision of the detector's interior and drew a simple sketch to indicate what he had found as he sought a way to effect a change in the device's operation. Thinking that the detector may have some inherent interference that would account for the anomalous readings, Puthoff spent several minutes speaking with Swann about topics other than the experiment, then briefly about the detector itself, noting the recorded trace afterward. Fluctuations appeared to correlate with Swann's moment-to-moment focus of attention. At this point, Swann claimed to feel physically drained. Puthoff agreed they should break for lunch, asking Dr. Hebert to continue monitoring the readout to see if any further anomalies occurred. The detector was continually operated for at least an hour after Puthoff and Swann left. Nothing of note was recorded. Puthoff and Swann returned to the basement lab the following day, but the apparatus was giving inconsistent readings, and they could not establish a baseline for comparison, so the attempt was abandoned. The implication of the magnetometer experiment is fairly unambiguous. Puthoff clearly believed that Swann used some inherent paranormal talent to affect Dr. Hebert's quark detector, or at the very least the paper chart recorder. The obvious flaw in this reasoning is that it does not take into account unrelated exterior factors which may have coincidentally caused the results given. The mechanism was occasionally prone to misbehaving, as is evidenced by the second-day failure to perform a calibration, and there is no way to be sure that Swann did not simply take credit for some momentary hiccup. In Puthoff's defense, it is clear from the descriptions of both Dr. Hebert and Puthoff himself, the experiment in the basement of the Varian building was never intended to be anything other than casual. Puthoff had invited Swann to the SRI on more or less a moment's notice, with very little structured research planned. Nothing that transpired in regards to the magnetometer was independently recorded, the paper readout the only tangible thing that itself is open to broad interpretation. All one has to go by are the memories of Dr. Puthoff, Dr. Hebert, and Ingo Swann, which, like all human memory, is inherently flawed, even when somewhat accurate. If Puthoff is to be believed, Dr. Martin Lee was also present during the experiment, yet there is very little to be found regarding his opinion. Perhaps Dr. Lee found nothing of any real consequence and simply shrugged the whole matter off. When later interviewed by illusionist James Randi, Dr. Hebert repeatedly references the presence of Puthoff's close colleague Russell Targ, which seems odd. Puthoff never mentions Targ in his recollections regarding the magnetometer within his own book. Puthoff in fact states after his summary of the events in the Varian building that Targ joined the SRI staff some months later. One could suppose Puthoff's memory is faulty, though Targ's presence would have undoubtedly given some weight to his claims. It is certainly possible Puthoff was mistaken, but it seems more likely that Dr. Hebert is misremembering. All this seems a trivial point until one considers most of the results of the experiment in question are not indelibly recorded. One cannot draw a conclusion either toward or against psychic effects based on what someone claims happened or didn't happen. Regardless, over several weeks, Puthoff built a rapport with Swann, devising a handful of various informal tests, the majority of which involved psychically determining the nature of small objects that were locked away inside a wooden box. As one might expect, these met with mixed success, though they were not completely unimpressive. Said Swann of one of the hidden objects, quote, "I see something small, brown, and irregular, sort of like a leaf or something like it, except that it seems very much alive, like it's even moving," unquote. The object, in this case, was a small moth. A lucky guess, perhaps.